What happens next for us? I don't know if it's going to stick to the path of clarity, but I'll tell you, it definitely makes sense with what Lacan is doing in this third lecture with the idea of the echo of the wall. And if we take very literally what it is that he says in the last passage we considered about this turning back, this turning away, this reverberating circuit. And what I want to do now is add some walls to this map of the littoral zone that we just scaled up with the discourse of the analyst right there in the middle of it. Now, I don't think we need to have the discourse of the analyst in there so pronounced in order to capture what it would mean to add some walls here. But in the production of walls within this diagram, what I think we arrive at is the logic of the echo, of that repetition with a difference that comprises not just psychoanalytic technique, according to Lacan, but also the work of radical psychoanalytic thought, according to Lacan. And if I were to draw it out, I would do the same thing that we just did. I would draw two overlapping circles, one on the right, one on the left, allowing for an intersectional littoral zone, liminal zone, if you will, between the two. And what I would do is I'd label them a little bit differently, but using more or less the same terms that we have. The left-hand circle would be that of truth, the real and sexual jouissance. The right-hand circle would be that of knowledge, the symbolic, and surplus jouissance. And then in the middle, again, we'd have the littoral zone, this palpable frontier. What I would add are some walls, some lines to this otherwise curvy diagram. And let me recall for you what that means. In nature, we see curves. Nature is the space of universal curvature, Lacan says in Seminar 18. In psychoanalytic theory, we see lines in addition to curves. The line of measurement, of assessment that Lacan was working up in Seminar 18 is also here in this little mini thing he does on the psychoanalyst knowledge, at the level imagistically of a wall. And here's how we could draw it. At that low water mark, we can draw a vertical line and label it matheme. At the high water mark, we can draw another vertical line and label it symptom. And then beyond them, we can draw two longer vertical lines in the middle of these circles, labeling the one in the field of land, society, and the one out to sea, the unconscious. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold up a diagram. I'll take a picture of this too and use it as the thumbnail for this lecture so that you'll be able to refer back to it yourself, because this one's a little tough just to talk through without being able to see it. But I went ahead and took a chance in drawing it in ways that I think are pretty useful here. What you see is, again, the spheres are labeled the exact same way. The littoral zone is there in between. And then I've introduced these four vertical lines, two shorter ones, one at high tide, which I've labeled symptom, one at low tide, which I've labeled matheme. And then I've got two longer vertical vectors, one in the field of society, labeled as such, and another out to sea, labeled unconscious. And the reason why I've drawn them this way is because I want to have a Pong-like ricochet reverberating experience here. And what I want to suggest is that we see in Lacan's understanding of symptoms and mathemes, the discourse of the analysand in the midst of the discourse of the analyst, popping in a way that really does start to look like an echo off of walls. These vertical lines are walls. The first wall, where it all begins, is society, on land. This is the origin of the unconscious. The materials, the signifiers, the representatives that pass out and eventually into the real realm of unconscious truth. And you'll notice how I'm drawing this. On land, all the arrows are solid. As soon as you get out to sea, though, they become dashed for reasons that are going to become clear in a second. Society produces the unconscious. Here is the figure of prohibition repressed. From the unary trait to the repressed element of any trauma, and so on and so forth. What goes into the unconscious goes out to sea. But it never stays there. It always comes washing back up in the form of a symptomatic expression. We don't know initially where the symptom comes from. We know it comes from out to sea, but we don't know the exact point of its origin. That's why the second arrow here is dashed until it reaches land, at which point it becomes a solid line, resulting in the formation of a symptom. Now, what I've told you so far is that when debris washes up on the beach, the waves oftentimes also carry it back to sea. When it's not left at the high tide mark, it can be carried back out to sea. And I've told you that the analyst is there at low tide, ankle, sometimes knee deep, waiting to gather up symptomatic expressions into the formation of mathemes. That's what we see in the third trajectory here. Society produces the unconscious for reasons that the most basic psychoanalytic theory can also account for. There's nothing new there. The unconscious is what commands symptomatic expression for reasons that Lacan explains in Seminar 18. And these symptoms then become the pieces that the analyst, as radical theorist, gathers into mathemes. That's this third trajectory here. Beyond these mathemes, however, as the analyst reaches out into the remit of the real, we also see another dashed line. So everything that occurs beyond land has a dashed line attached to it because it is uncertain whether and to what extent this symptom carries with it the value of unconscious truth. Just as it is uncertain whether and to what extent any given analyst's mathemes carry within them the value of the truth of the unconscious. You see, so we really are thinking along that truth valuational logical line that we developed in our last lecture, with the idea being that symptoms have to be tested as to whether and to what extent they carry the value of the truth, the value of the unconscious truth of the analysand. And mathemes have to also be tested to determine whether and to what extent they carry the value of the truth of the unconscious, this S2 atop which the analyst sits. So I offer this new diagram as a way for us to get working at the level of the echo, because all we're really talking about here is a ricochet effect from society to the unconscious, to the symptom, to the matheme, and if all goes well, right back out to sea. Let me ask you, though, by way of review here, what happens in this second echo when symptomatic expressions turn back, bouncing off the high water mark, the high water wall, what we might even call an anti-tsunami wall, if you will, heading back in the direction of the true, the real, and the unconscious? I want to think about this very clearly. Whether you want to call this the second echo or the third, it doesn't matter. The point is still the same. We're asking what happens when symptoms turn back, bouncing off the analysand's speech, and head out to sea again. The path that they take, Lacan says, and path is the image he uses in this lecture, is a logical one. And I would add not just logical, but also topological, also directly from the lecture that we've been reading here. Now, it's tempting to take this topological turn in the direction of the Klein bottle that we see on page 94 of this lecture, and from there back into Lacan's earlier formulas of masculine and feminine enjoyment. He invites us to do this, but I think we could do a little better by moving a little slower. Trust me, there's going to be plenty of topology and Klein bottles and returns to masculine and feminine jouissance in our future when we get into seminars 19, 20, and beyond. So again, I want to keep it simple and slow, and to be sure, quite literal here. It's the logic of a certain topo, a certain topos, a certain place, this littoral zone that we've been studying. I think that's clear at this point. If what we've been doing is topological, it's because we've been studying the logic of a certain topos, a certain place, this place known as the littoral zone, as this palpable frontier between truth and knowledge. This is what we've been working on in this series and its predecessor. And we've been working on it at the level of a map, which, among my backpacking friends, we would just call a topo. At sea, we call them charts. On land, we call them topos, as in like topographical map. That's really what we've been doing. You might say it's not topological, and instead topographical, because we're dealing at the level of a map, land, sea, and a beach in between. You can find lots of maps that show just this thing. But I would suggest, on the contrary, once we start adding our terms, we are indeed dealing with a very certain topology, a logic that proceeds through this map. And that is what is at stake here. Not a return to this diagram, but an accounting for the way that math and logic find their home on this page. This map of the palpable frontier between truth and knowledge is occupied by the analytic discourse we've seen. And I want to suggest that there is indeed a rigorous path that is cut from the high tide line of symptoms to the low tide line of mathemes, in line with what Lacan is asking for here in this lecture that we're reviewing. The third trajectory in our updated topo is the one we're talking about here. This line which extends from the symptom out to the matheme and beyond it toward the unconscious. This line in our updated topo, if you will, it is first and foremost mathematico-logical, as Lacan puts it on page 88. The radical form of scientific inquiry that we have defined as psychoanalytic thought is one part mathematics and one part logic. And that's what he's capturing here with this notion of the mathematico-logical. Whatever it is that the radical psychoanalytic theorist does, it is one part math and another part logic at least. What do we mean by that? The mathematical part of radical psychoanalytic thought, as we now know, culminates in the formulation of mathemes, each of which, like the symptoms which induced them, has a certain truth value, you've heard me say, specifically a certain relation to the part of truth that cannot be said, which is impossible to speak, namely the real. So as you consider this third echo, this echo off the wall of the symptom as it heads back out, here's what you can say about this. From symptom to matheme, we see the part of truth that can be said. The part of truth that takes a name when the symptom comes up and is given a name when the symptom induces the matheme. This is what we've been talking about. In this littoral zone between symptom and matheme, high tide and low tide, we see names of the real. We see the parts of truth that can be said. And we see ways of mathematically representing that. That's what the discourse of the analyst captures, among other things. In fact, it's what Lacan's theory of discourse, as that four-footed blueprint for the formation of all the discourses, captures. What we see in the center of those discourses is the space in which the truth that can be said is indeed spoken. This dashed arrow, though, that heads from the matheme back out to sea, beyond the low tide mark, points us beyond, if you will. And I'm not using that term lightly, but beyond the part of truth that can be said, and toward the part of truth that remains unspeakable, impossible, and for this reason, real. The logical part of radical psychoanalytic theory is designed to measure and assess, to account for, as Lacan puts it in the previous lecture, this relationship between the matheme that shows the part of truth that can be said and the truth that can't be spoken, whose value this matheme attempts to convey. So that's just it. The part of truth that can be said, you've heard me say again and again, always says the same thing. Beyond this point, I can speak no further. The part of truth that can be said always speaks about its other part, this other part of it that can't be spoken beyond this point. Again, that's why Lacan says that truth loves itself. It loves itself because it loves talking about itself, because in its foremost expression, as a name of the real, it always says there's this other thing that can't be named. That's what the name of the real is. It's a declaration of the impossible. It's a statement of impotence. It is an utterance that always says, beyond this point I can speak no further. And as such, it is always an enigmatic signifier of something that defies signification, namely the real. Let me be clear. The logical part of radical psychoanalytic theory does something different from the mathematical part of radical psychoanalytic theory. The mathematical formulations, and let's be clear, Lacan develops an algebra. That's what he's famous for. That's what you see in Lacan's thought, is the gradual development of what would be called an algebra. All these little letters and numbers and parentheses and all this shit, these graphs, it is an algebra. These algebras culminate in mathemes, which are mathematical formulations of certain impasses that crop up in analytic experience and beyond. That's the mathematical component, the development of mathemes. But here, in these riffs on the psychoanalyst's knowledge, Lacan is adding a logical component. There's also this logical side of psychoanalytic thought. It's not just mathematics, it's also logic. What does the logic part do? The same thing that logic has always done for mathematics, Lacan says. Namely, it assesses, gauges, and accounts for the relationship between mathematical propositions and truth. 4 plus 3 equals 8. The truth value of that proposition is false. 4 plus 3 does not equal 8. So its value relative to truth is quite low. Lacan is not thinking as starkly as this, but when he says truth value, this is what he has in mind. To what extent does any symptomatic expression hook into the unconscious truth that drives the analysand? Not every slip of the tongue hooks into and maybe the unconscious truth of the analysand. Logic in psychoanalytic theory is what accounts for that, which is why I say it is always a truth valuational logic. The logic of radical psychoanalytic thought is truth valuational because it always assesses the extent to which any given utterance connects to truth. An utterance here is a proposition in symbolic logic. The same is true of the matheme. To what extent does the matheme of the analytic discourse connect to the truth of the unconscious atop which the analyst sits in analytic experience? Logic is there to account for this. Whether and to what extent the matheme of the discourse of the analyst comports with the truth atop which analysis occurs. The truth value of the analytic discourse requires logic to be assessed. Logic is what determines whether and to what extent any given matheme in psychoanalytic theory comports with the truth of the unconscious atop which analytic experience unfolds in the clinic. I know this is a lot, but it is precisely what Lacan asks us to work with here in these lectures on the psychoanalyst's knowledge. We are just following his reel. This reel in question, this unspeakable bit beyond the matheme that the logic of radical psychoanalytic thought attempts to account for by way of the matheme, in a way that tries to account for the truth or lack thereof that any given matheme might convey. And let me tell you, there are lots of mathemes out there by purported Lacanians that convey very little fucking truth. If the matheme, via mathematics, brings us to the edge of the whole in knowledge, and allows us to formulate this edge as a matheme, logic, again, is doing something different. Logic is what allows us to go one step further. From ankle deep in mathemes at the low water mark to knee deep, maybe even further, perhaps even beyond where we can touch, in the direction of the real. Now, it's been a minute since we considered a passage from Lacan's own work, and you know how we like to do it in here. I'm not just going to stand up here and yammer on about shit without having this shit anchored in Lacan's own. Check it out. Page 88 gives us a lot of what we need here in terms of accounting for what all this amounts to. Is that which resonates the origin of the res, Latin for thing, from which reality is wrought? This is a question that touches on everything that may be extracted from language in the capacity of logic. All right, here we go. Hang on, y'all. It is widely known that logic is not sufficient, and that for some time now it has needed. This could have been seen making an appearance some time ago precisely with Plato, to bring mathematics into play. So logic needs mathematics, the same way that mathematics needs logic. Well, maybe not in the exact same way, but in the sense that they reciprocally depend upon each other. The work of mathematics relative to truth requires logic. And now what Lacan is saying is that logic also requires mathematics, bringing mathematics into play as well. It is here that the question arises as to where the real is to be centered, the real to which logical examination leads us, and which turns out to lie at the mathematical level. Here is that mathematico-logic, with a hyphen in between, that Lacan is working at here. Mathematically, psychoanalytic theory culminates in the matheme that brings us to the edge of the whole in knowledge. Logic assesses whether and to what extent that matheme allows us to reach beyond that edge and into the remit of the real that is in fact this whole. That's how they work together. And that's why he says that when the two are working together, math and logic, it's here that the question arises as to where this real is to be centered, the real to which logical examination leads us. Note, it's not mathematical work that leads us to the real. Mathematics brings us to the edge, where the real can be named. where elements of the symbolic, letters, numbers, ciphers, can be assigned to the real. It is in the littoral zone where we see names of the real that the matheme is induced. Logic takes us one step further, where the real is to be centered, the real to which logical examination leads us, and yet a real which turns out to lie at the mathematical level. Why is this important? Because it's a powerful reminder of what we mean when we talk about the real. We are still at the level of mathematical logic when we talk about the real. The real is not some beyond, despite the image of it being out to sea. It is not, in fact, beyond the symbolic. The real is better to be understood as a whole around which the symbolic takes shape. And that's why in the first diagram of this mini-series on the psychoanalyst knowledge, I transformed the Euler circles into more of a lake-like scenario, where you have three concentric circles. The innermost circle is that of the sea, of truth. The next circle out is that of the littoral zone, and beyond that is the circle of land, of knowledge, of truth. That first diagram, refer back to it. That's what we're alluding to here. Yes, mathematics brings us to the edge of that little lake. Logic is what assesses whether and to what extent we are in fact on that edge, and what we can reach in the remit of the real beyond it. In other words, what we can say about the whole that edge opens into. It's not a beyond of the symbolic, though. It is every bit a whole in the symbolic. You know how I know this? Because every lake, sea, and ocean is ultimately bordered by land. You have your beach, dear Californians, but so also do you, dear Mandarins. Which brings me back to that point about the work here being not just topographic, but also topologic. Part of what's happening in the map work that we've done, whether it's a lake surrounded by a beach, surrounded by land, or a classic littoral zone on the coast, and looking out to sea beyond which you can't see anything but sky, because the earth, guess what, is round. And as a result, the beach on the other side of that ocean, Chinese and otherwise, for us West Coasters, for instance, also shows that even the largest body of water is bounded by land, and with it another littoral zone. Oceans don't go on forever. The same is true of the real. The real is a whole in knowledge. Its depth remains to be seen. That's part of what math and logic help us do. But it is contained, if you will, by the symbolic. The symbolic is structured around this void, the same way that the subject is structured around the 0 point left behind by castration and signaled by objet A. All of which puts us precisely on point here. This is why Lacan prioritizes ciphers and cipherings in these lectures on the psychoanalyst knowledge. All, again, from the Arabic name for zero, which is a figure used to mark absence, emptiness, nothingness, bottomless lakes galore. And don't forget about objet A in all of this. It's a cipher, if ever there was one. It's the cipher of psychoanalysis, this objet A. It always marks an opening, a gap, a distance, a difference, where we, in fact, ultimately see just a whole. In this sense, I would say that little a is not just an effect of castration, but also its basic index. And here we start transitioning to Lacan's conclusion in this third lecture in Talking to Brick Walls. To say that little a indexes a whole in knowledge is fair enough, but it's still insufficient, I believe, for the clarity and conceptual coherence that we're after here, that we are determined to work at. Here's what we know so far. At the edge of the whole in knowledge, we find the parts of truth that can be said. Here is the littoral zone on the edge of the sea, where names of the real pop up. And what these statements of truth say is always the same, as you know. Namely, that there is another side of truth, a part of truth that cannot be said. Here's that whole, not its edge, but the whole itself, this part of truth that cannot be said, and yet which we never cease talking about and pronouncing at the level of names of the real. What else, I want to conclude by asking here, can we say about this whole, beyond the fact that it's indexed by little a and occupied by the part of truth that cannot be said? What else can we get as we approach this whole? And here we're thinking logically. I think we can get the same thing that we've been saying about this whole since our series on Seminar 16. The whole in knowledge indexed by little a is the site of sexual jouissance, that mythical, wildly ulterior mode of enjoyment that only ever shows up as and in its own prohibition. And always, recall, in close connection to its earthly landlocked sibling, surplus enjoyment. This is review, but it is deeply relevant to what we're doing right now. In the phantasmatic field of surplus enjoyment, sexual enjoyment appears as paradise lost, you've heard me say in other lectures, but also as a paradise to be regained. And I'm queuing this up now because in Friday's discussion, this very topic came up. It was a point-blank question about the relationship between surplus and sexual enjoyment. And it is a key question that is happening here in Talking to Brick Walls. So I'm eager to return to it, happy to recall what we've already said about this. It amounts to the following: wholeness, fulfillment, Edenic bliss, all the figures of sexual enjoyment that constitute the fundamental fantasies of late capitalism, notably consumer culture. And let me be clear about this as well. I get emails from folks who don't live in capitalist economies, and one of whom gives me a lot of hell over this, saying, how dare you ridicule late capitalism and those consumer cultures? Do you know what I would give to just be able to go to the store and to be able to choose from various pairs of shoes? Do you know what I would give to be able to live in a consumer culture? I'm still tripped out by some of these emails that I receive. But in the world in which I spend most of my time, by God, it's a late capitalist consumer economy where I see the promise of wholeness, fulfillment, and Edenic bliss, all of these figures of sexual enjoyment bandied about, and always at the level of surplus enjoyment. And I think that's problematic. Whether you would like to have that problem or not, let me tell you, having that problem makes it, no, it's still problematic as hell. And the reason is this: every pursuit of surplus enjoyment, every purchasing of a commodity, whether we're buying a pack of smokes or one of those little aroused Santas in a barrel to hold the smokes. Have you seen these? It's Santa in a barrel, and you load it with your cigarettes, and then when you lift up the barrel, a cigarette pops out from between Santa's legs, and then you can pull out the cigarette. Now, if you put that thing in filter first, you don't even need to use your hand. You can just hold up Santa's tumescent self and pluck off his phallic signifier. Light it and enjoy. But make no mistake, the enjoyment that we have from the little horny Santa to the mouth into which his phallic signifier fits is surplus enjoyment. Which is why it's not only safe, but I believe hella smart to say that surplus enjoyment is a semblance of sexual enjoyment. And I say this because it puts us squarely on the path toward the latter. Notice how Lacan works this. Again, returning to the essay we're reading. It's on page 100, a little bit deeper in this text, right towards the end. What psychoanalysis demonstrates is precisely that the jouissance that might be called sexual, in inverted commas, the jouissance that would not be a semblance of the sexual, bears the stamp of nothing more, until further notice, than what is not stated, than what is not announced, except as the index of castration. So, sexual enjoyment always has to be in quotation marks, because that shit, technically speaking, does not exist. It only exists as prohibition, as its prohibition, you've heard me say in other series. But notice this other bit about the fact that sexual enjoyment in inverted commas is not a semblance of the sexual. Here he's referring to surplus enjoyment. Surplus enjoyment is a semblance of sexual enjoyment. Sexual enjoyment cannot be stated, cannot be announced. The opposite is true of surplus enjoyment. What does he mean by this? He means that sexual enjoyment resides in the parts of truth that cannot be said, that cannot be stated, that cannot be announced. That's what sexual enjoyment is. It's the part of truth that can't be said, and that we never tire of talking about when we find ourselves at our limits. But notice this last bit in the passage. It can't be stated, it can't be announced, except as the index of castration. Notice this shift to castration, one of the topics with which we began. Little a, you've heard me say, is an index of castration. Why? Because it's also an effect of castration, exactly as we've been saying from the start. 1 minus 1 equals 0. Phi minus phi equals A. Question: where are we to locate castration? In the latest iteration of our Euler diagram, this map that we've been fucking with. Where are we to locate castration in this thing? This diagram of the palpable frontier, the beachhead between truth and knowledge, real and the symbolic, sexual jouissance and its semblance. Where is castration in all of this? Can we pin it down? On this point, Lacan is explicit. The locus of castration, he plainly says on page 97, is everywhere. Between truth and knowledge, real and symbolic, the sexual and its semblance, there is castration everywhere. And behind every wall in our revised diagram, with its echoes from society to the unconscious, to the symptom, to the matheme, and back out to sea, you might say. Behind all of these walls, all four of them, and in front of each of them, behind every symptom and every matheme, there is castration as well. Where there is castration, I'd like to conclude by saying something familiar. And this is that second bit of familiar terrain. Repetition was the first where the lecture began. Here, at the end, we arrive at the second. Where there is castration, I'd like to suggest that there is also love. Again and again, Lacan returns to this very topic, and it is everywhere in the last bit of this third lecture on talking to brick walls. Why is capitalism rotten, according to Lacan? Because it rejects castration, and with it, love. You want to know why capitalism sucks? Those of you who wish you had a little more of it in your life, it rejects castration, and it sweeps love aside. The best pages for this, I believe, are pages 90 through 91. starts at the bottom of page 90. Lacan's quite explicit. I'd hate to have you miss this part. What differentiates the discourse of capitalism is Verwerfung, the fact of rejecting outside all the fields of the symbolic. Well, that's not as helpful as we'd like it to be, but notice what he does next. This brings with it the consequence I have already said it has. What does it, capitalism, reject? Well, castration. Any order, any discourse that aligns itself with capitalism sweeps to one side what we may simply call, my fine friends, matters of love. You see, it's a mere nothing. If that's why capitalism sucks, because it rejects castration and with it love, let's ask the other question, the inverse question. Why is the analytic discourse so prized by Lacan? And why has it taken center stage in our work as well? Why is the analytic discourse so valuable now more than ever? It's simple. Because it embraces castration, and in so doing opens late capitalist logics and subjects alike, you and me, to something known as love. This is such a key insight, and yet all too often it's one that's lost on Lacanians. And this is not me talking, Lacan is saying this. It's 1972, and he's pissed that the connection between castration and love has been lost on analysts. Lacan doesn't think that psychoanalytic theory has fully caught up with this insight regarding castration's relation to love, and that it certainly hasn't found terms for it. Check it out. It's in the next lines, just after the passage we read. This was precisely why, 2 centuries after this slippage, which after all we may call a Calvinist slippage, he's talking about capitalism, castration finally made its eruptive entrance in the form of the analytic discourse. Naturally, the analytic discourse still hasn't bloody got around to providing so much as a slither of an articulation of this. So let's try and provide a slither of articulation of this thing that the psychoanalytic discourse in 1972 has yet to get around to bloody providing. What exactly is the relationship between castration and love that psychoanalysis supports, often unbeknownst to its foremost theorists, Lacan's here suggesting? It's what we see between men and women, Lacan says on page 95. Now this certainly gives us a clue. The relationship between castration and love is precisely what we see between men and women. But where on earth are we to go from here with this statement? Between men and women. Anytime Lacan says men and women, I start to trip out. I'm like, oh man, what the fuck's going on here? Where are we to go with this insight that this is exactly what we see between men and women? Recall what Lacan says about castration being everywhere on page 97. As for the relation between man and woman, he returns to that topic, and everything that results from it with regard to either partner, namely his or her position as well as his or her knowledge, this means that castration is everywhere. Love, the love that this conveys, that flows, that gushes, this is what love is, isn't it? Love, the good that a mother wishes her son, l'amour. Notice the French still here. You just have to put brackets around the little a to meet once more what we experience firsthand on a daily basis, namely, that even between mother and son, the mother's relation to castration counts a fair bit. To get a sound idea of what love is, Lacan continues, one should perhaps base oneself on the fact that when it is played out seriously between a man and a woman, it always entails the stake of castration. It is what castrates. What is it that files down this narrow pass of castration? This is something we shall be trying to broach along paths that ought to be somewhat rigorous. There's that word again, rigorous. They can only be rigorous by being, you guessed it, logical and even topological. This rigorous, logical, and even topological path is precisely the one that we've been following in our ever-evolving map of the palpable frontier between truth and knowledge. Don't get it twisted. That's precisely the path that we've been following. But it's also the one that we've been blazing through Lacan's thought for several series now, whenever we've discussed his definition of love, which has often occurred. There can be no other definition of love in Lacan's thought, mind you. Love is giving what we don't have. And what do we know about this so far? To not have is to lack, and to lack is to be castrated. At some level, it's as simple as that. And to share all of this with someone else, allowing them to be just as lacking and just as castrated, albeit, of course, in different ways. This is what it means to love them. To love someone is to share with them the fact, the field, and the function of castration. You know what else, though? This is not just what it means to love other people, ourselves first and foremost. This is also, as you'll recall, what it means to love truth. The truth that, don't get it twisted, has always been at stake at this point in Lacan's thought. Logic is there to assess the truth value of symptoms and mathemes alike, namely whether and to what extent they convey the truth, and in so doing allow us to reach that part of truth that can't be said, all in the field of logico-mathematics. This truth that is also loved when we give what we don't have to someone else is a love of the truth of the unconscious and a love of every unconscious truth. Yours, mine, theirs, alike. This is also a love of castration. To love others is to love castration. That's what's at stake in Lacan's theory of love. And I want to suggest, here at the end of things, that what's ultimately at stake in Lacanian theory and technique is a love of castration as weakness, as impotence, as what he calls in this little bit on the psychoanalyst knowledge, powerlessness. And don't just take my word for it. I want you to recall Lacan's here in what is arguably one of the most profound and bone-deep statements in his work up to this point, at least if you ask me. It's in Seminar 17, in passages we have returned to many times, on page 52 of the English translation of Seminar 17. Page 58, if what you want to consult here is the French. Final word, and then we're out. It's not mine, but Lacan's. What is the love of truth? It's something that mocks the lack in being of truth. We could call this lack in being something else, the lack of forgetting, which reminds us of its existence in formations of the unconscious. This is nothing of the order of being, of a being that is in any way full. What is this indestructible desire Freud speaks of at the end of his Traumdeutung, his interpretation of dreams? What is this desire that nothing can change or deflect when everything changes? The lack of forgetting is the same thing as the lack in being, since being is nothing other than forgetting. And then here's the famous final line in the paragraph. The love of truth is the love of this weakness whose veil we have lifted. It's the love of what truth hides, which is called castration. Reading on. 2 more quick paragraphs, and then we're out. I should not need these reminders, Lacan continues, which are in some way so bookish. It seems that it is among analysts, particularly among them, that in the name of these few taboo words with which their discourse is soiled, one is never made aware of what truth is, what knowledge is, what impotence is. It is upon this that everything that has to do with truth is constructed. That there is a love of weakness is in no doubt the essence of love. As I have said, love is giving what one doesn't have, namely what might make good this original weakness. It's from page 52 of the English translation. Now I can go on talking about love, of others, of truth, of weakness, of castration. Lacan certainly does here at the end. But I don't want to be that fool again and again, that imbecile to talk of love, which is why I'm perfectly content instead to read what has been written about love in this printing of what Lacan said about love in Seminar 17. And for us, that's always been the stake here around the littoral zone. And the pure writing effected in symptomatic expression and mathematical formulation alike. Pure writing begets debate, speech, discussion, even imbecilic speech, especially imbecilic speech, I would suggest, about love.